Hi. Um, at this point in the class, what we're trying to do is prepare for paper two. And just like in paper one, I wanted you to have some resources when it came to essentially not going it alone. This is a difficult book to dissect. There's a lot of moving parts to it. It's a difficult topic to kind of get into. Now, I have assigned books before that have dealt with the civil rights movement. They have dealt with issues involving race relations in the United States or lack thereof. They've all been a little bit more cut and dry than what you're going to see in Native Son. Um, I'll get into the topic of Native Son, the main issues, in just a moment. But for the time being, understand that the main character of Bigger Thomas is, shall we say, controversial. Um, it was easier to relate to an individual like Jurgis Rudkis in the sense that clearly these issues involving institutionalized inequality were preventing him from freedom, at least how people had envisioned American freedom in the Revolution. It certainly prevented equality from spelling itself out in the streets of Chicago. Bigger Thomas is a little bit more complex than that. So let me take this from the top. Um, Richard Wright is a world-famous author, and one that I bet that you have read before, or at least heard about in some point in your academic career. Probably the one that you're most familiar about is his novel entitled Black Boy. The issue of civil rights and race relations had always played a really important role in his work. You have to understand the context in which he's writing Native Son. One of the things that had come to be very trendy in American literature, maybe not very trendy, but certainly it was an emerging genre of American literature, something called proletarian literature. Now, the term proletarian or proletariat is a Marxist term, and for those of you that have been coming to class regularly, you'll know that the combination of the Popular Front as well as a lot of leaders within cultural movements, cultural genres in the arts, subscribed to a more radical left-of-center political philosophy than anything that we had seen going into the 1930s. So communism essentially, maybe not as a political philosophy, but certainly the concepts involving communism had become a little more trendier by the 1930s. And by the end of the 1930s, um, there were mainstream writers, and Richard Wright is one of them. Langston Hughes is another, although I realize he's a poet, that had begun to pick up this idea of proletarian literature. Now, of course, this is not the only proletarian novel that you could read, but it does lend itself well to race relations in American life at the time. So what I'd like you to understand here is he's writing in a very important, very specific context. Workers are trying to form unions, and people like Henry Ford are beating them back. People are trying to fight for a more equitable division of American life, and in some instances, it's not going as well as it may seem it should go. Um, I guess one of the more important things that I would point out is even as progressive, if you want to call it that, as the progressive era and the New Deal era were, you don't get any kind of meaningful civil rights regulation, let alone reforms. So that's going to come a little bit later. Um, Similar to The Jungle, Richard Wright is writing this story in Chicago. And in particular, he's talking about the south side of Chicago, the African American district. Early on in that book, you get a lot of implications as to how and why life is not fair in the black community. Bigger complains that he wanted to be a pilot, but they won't let him go to the school where they train you to be a pilot. It's inside the white district of Chicago, so therefore that's out of bounds. Furthermore, there's a white district in Chicago. There's places where black people simply cannot live. Um, there's all of these things. I mean, in the initial stages, he's talking about wanting to rob a white establishment, a white newsstand or something like that. And he's got a lot of reluctance. He's very hesitant to do that because he understands, or at least he says he understands, it's one thing to rob a black newsstand, commit a black on black crime. It's another thing to do this black on white, okay? Now, all of the earlier parts of the story are important, but if you're looking for the real crux of the issue, you can really skim through, or you don't have to hang on every word, leading through the murder of Mary Dalton and later on uh, Bessie Mears. Um, Skip to page 344, which is approximately halfway through the book, and that's where you're going to get to the trial. Now, I'm going to fast forward a little bit and get you to understand that Bigger Thomas is being put on trial for the murder of Mary Dalton, who essentially was an accidental murder. I'll get into that in a second. The second is Bessie Mears, and Bigger essentially kills her to silence her so that she can't say anything. She had begun to suspect that there was something going on. She was Bigger's girlfriend, and he basically just decides that he can't take the chance. So ultimately, he's being accused of these two murders. It's the trial that's really going to be important because it's in the trial that you're really going to get the meat of this question that I'm asking you to entertain. So before I go any further, what I think would be helpful if I had to write this paper, the way that I might come out at this is imagine myself as somebody who's sitting on that jury that's going to ultimately determine the fate of Bigger Thomas. You have to vote guilty or not guilty. Think of it in those ways as you dissect the arguments of both the prosecution as well as the defense. Um, as the question prompt implied, the defense and its argument is going to hinge on the idea that it was racism, ethnic, religious prejudices, class conflict, xenophobia that ultimately produced the hate that you're seeing in this particular story. Um, we've talked about issues involving institutionalized inequality. As a matter of fact, that's a really important part of the first part of this class. We found out that in 1896 we see the legalization of Jim Crow. Plessy versus Ferguson emphasizes, as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, that as long as the accommodations are equal, which they rarely were, but at least on paper, then you could segregate however you wanted to. Now, the segregation of the races was important for a lot of reasons, primarily because although it said separate but equal, it was rarely, if ever, equal. The black school was always inferior to that of the white school. It was this idea of inferiority that was deeply instilled in the black conscious. As a matter of fact, when we get to this time period in the survey, I'll talk to you about how and why the Supreme Court ultimately reversed its decision in 1954 and said separate but equal has no place, at least in the institution of education. But understand that you're telling people of color, in this particular instance African Americans, you're not good enough to come to this school, and that is a life lesson that ultimately they'll be carrying with them for the rest of their life. It also gives rise to an idea that you might call white privilege, in the sense that you can clearly see that there are rich people and there are dirt poor white people. Um, but at the same time, and this is part of the reason that slavery survived for as long as it did, considering how many people it worked against economically, at least on paper, you could grow up to be the next Andrew Carnegie, because on paper you had the ability to get into the white school and go to the white college and get into the white clubs, and you could cast a vote, you could register to vote, you had a place at the table if you could manage to get there, which was very difficult, but at least on paper. And so, again, you're instilling this idea of inferiority, you're instilling this idea of second-class citizenship, and these are issues that Richard Wright, I think, is trying to get us to understand are coming home to roost by 1940, okay? You've got issues involving Chinese exclusion. We talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we made mention of one of the most loudest outspoken, proponents, supporters of just simply shutting off immigration from China was a working class organization known as the Working Man's Party, typically of California, where most Chinese were coming through. What this is a nativist backlash. It's a xenophobic idea that these foreigners, in this case Chinese, are stealing your jobs, and they're bringing with them all these quote-unquote anti-American customs and habits and religions, and they're degenerating American culture. And these are all things that Richard Wright touches upon with respect to native son. Okay. Lastly, and I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. Um, the progressive era, this really important moment in American history where we begin to see people like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson take on a very proactive role in regulating the American economy so it's fairer for everybody, so that multinational corporations can't just completely write the laws and make government work for them because they can afford to do so. In the New Deal, you see another really important commitment to making American life more equitable. In 1935, you see the establishment of the Wagner Act that says that workers get the ability to form unions. You see the Social Security Act, kind of an old age pension funded by the government that, what Franklin Roosevelt said he was going for with that was the security blanket that he had known since a boy. But since he was a boy, he was a very, very rich man, and he wanted everybody to have that kind of security. What's largely missing is civil rights. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is the place that the Democratic Party is strongest, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Progressive era or the New Deal era, you are talking about um, politicians that were committed to the idea of reform. Um, One of the areas that the Democratic Party matters most is the American South. And so, for example, Franklin Roosevelt, for all the magic that he was able to pull out of the New Deal and get law after law after law passed, not one involved a law that made lynching a federal crime. In other words, you're not going to see people in various parts of the country really take the prosecution of lynching serious. So the only place that you can really go after these offenders is in federal courts, and you can't even get the federal government to establish an anti-lynching bill as late as the 1930s. Okay, so you don't see civil rights reform. So it's not simply saying, wait and change will come. And even when people began to say, wait, because better days are on the horizon, you had other individuals like Martin Luther King, who wrote this letter from his jail cell that came to be known as the letter from the Birmingham jail, that are saying, if you looked into the history, and certainly Richard Wright would be an example of this history, you'd see why we find it so difficult to wait. When you're constantly reminded that you are African American and you live this second class existence, and so on and so forth, it makes it very difficult to wait. Okay? So this is kind of the backdrop of institutionalized inequality that I think that you could make a case for when it comes for what the defense is trying to point out. That there's a part in the book, and if you would, if you've got a copy of Richard Wright with you, I want you to turn to page 446, which again is in the last third of the book, called Fate. But on the top of 446, if your book looks like mine, it's his lawyer, a guy by the name of Mr. Max, Boris Max. He asked the question to Bigger in his jail cell, why did you start hating Mary, the white woman that he murdered? And over the course of time, what Bigger points out, and I'm quoting him here in the middle of 446, Mr. Max, a guy gets tired of being told what he can and can't do. You get a little job here and a little job there. You shine shoes, sweep streets, anything. You don't make enough to live on. You don't know when you're going to get fired. Pretty soon you get so you can't hope for nothing. You just keep moving all the time, doing what other folks say. You ain't a man no more. You just work day in and day out so the world can roll on and other people can live. You know, Mr. Max, I always think of white folks. And so, what I think Max is getting out of him in this case is when he was trying to avoid being discovered in Mary's room and accidentally chokes her, he suffocates her, in case you haven't gotten to that part. It was not intentional. It was not planned. There was no motive involved in it. He was just trying to get her up to her room because she had been drinking. And so, for a black man to be discovered in the presence of a white woman was akin to rape. It was one of the ultimate taboos in American life, not just in the places where you would suspect it would be, but we're talking about Chicago in the North. Okay, so anyway, what Max is going to take away from this is Bigger was put into a situation primarily caused by institutionalized inequality, structured inequality, where he felt he did not have any other alternative. He had to keep Mary from making a sound, else he run the risk of being discovered, which would have been akin to ultimately how this story ends for Bigger in the first place. Okay. Now, if you flip over to page 448, you'll see a little bit more as far as what I'm talking about. Essentially, Boris Max is asking Bigger, why did you do it? I mean, wasn't there another way around this? And so if you look in the page of 448, you'll see what I'm talking about. And again, I'm quoting him directly. I don't know, maybe this sounds crazy, maybe they're going to burn me in the electric chair for feeling this way, but I ain't worried none about them women I killed. For a little while, I was free. I was doing something. It was wrong, but I was feeling all right. Maybe God will get me for it. If he do, all right. But I ain't worried. I killed him because I was scared and mad. But I've been scared and mad all my life, and after I killed that first woman, I wasn't scared nor no more for a little while. And so there again, in a sense, what is driving all of this is the issue and institution of fear. That Jim Crow is enforced, not in the courts necessarily, but through the institution of violence and fear, intimidation. And so once again, you get into a situation where Bigger is pretty much saying, and certainly Max is massaging those words and saying in court, he was given a situation where it was really, really difficult for him to maneuver, and therefore felt that his only way out was to, kill if necessary. And after that had happened, it was almost a situation where what left can they do to me? I mean, they're gonna kill me for the murder of this woman. People have been lynched for far, far less in American history, and so therefore, that's essentially setting him free. Now, I'm hopeful that I'm not glorifying murder or violence here. I'm just trying to articulate, how the character of Bigger Thomas is being presented by Richard Wright. But one more example before we move on, and then we'll talk about a related topic. On 448, near the end of the book, this is in the middle of the trial. This is Boris Max that's arguing his case in front of the judge, and I'm quoting him directly again. What is the cause of all this high feeling and excitement? He's talking about, the mobs that were gathering outside the courthouse and the massive, multi-thousand man manhunt for Bigger Thomas when he was on the loose. Is it the crime of Bigger Thomas? Were Negroes liked yesterday and hated today because of what he has done? Were labor unions and workers' halls raided solely because a Negro committed a crime? Did those white bones lying on the table evoke the gasp of horror that went up from the nation? Did the feeling against Jews in the city rise only because a Jewish lawyer is defending a black boy? He goes on, Your Honor, you know this is not the case. All of the factors in the present hysteria existed before Bigger Thomas was ever heard of. Negroes, workers, and labor unions were hated as much yesterday as they are today. And so what Max is trying to establish here is that over the course of time, this institutionalized inequality that was aimed not only at African Americans, but political minorities like workers and radicals as well, religious minorities such as Jews, ethnic minorities. I've used the example of the Chinese, but certainly you could throw in the Irish immigrants that had come to the United States in the 1840s and 50s. There's plenty of things that you could kind of point to when it comes to this developing feeling of keeping people down, keeping people in their places. Now, when the defense rests its case, it doesn't call any witnesses, it doesn't call any experts to the stand. It simply rests its case on the idea that this is the hate that hate essentially produced. The prosecution is going to have the last say in this, and basically what it's going to do, instead of really giving you an actual motive, an actual reason for why Bigger Thomas committed this first murder, ultimately what he's going to do, in my opinion, this was just my opinion, you can take it for however little it's worth, but in my opinion it played right into the hands of the defense in the sense that he came after this communist ideology, philosophy, and the quote-unquote perversion of the truth and things of that sort. And so in the sense he's kind of making Max's point right there in front of the judge, but in the end, as most of you should know by now, the judge is not persuaded, and Bigger Thomas is sentenced to be executed through the electric chair. Now, just like the last time, there is more to this paper and writing this paper than simply telling me this happened and this happened and this happened in Native Son. Obviously, you need to take the issues that you see being discussed in this book very serious, and I need to see that you have a firm understanding of what's going on there. But it's also really important for you to bring in other issues that we're seeing involved in our class. I've referenced a couple of them with respect to Plessy versus Ferguson, Chinese immigration, but there's a laundry list of things that you could point to with respect to this development of inequality, okay? And so in the next video segment, what I'm going to do is try to connect the dots for you. I've given you a brief overview of what you really need to focus on for Native Son. Now what's really important is kind of putting other pieces of the puzzle together and getting the reader to see that this is happening not in some small vacuum, but in the big picture. So we'll pick it up from there.